Good afternoon, my friends. This is the Grim Flayer. Hope you're doing very well today. Welcome to the second installment of a mini-series focusing on Modern Horizons 2 speculation. We are not speculating about what they might design as far as brand new cards go. We are also not speculating about what currently modern legal cards could be reprinted for financial reasons. We are focusing in this series only on what cool, currently existing but not modern legal old cards might be brought to the modern format by way of this set. So this is a continuation of the first video in this vein. We are just covering more cards that we didn't get to cover the first time out. Also, a quick note, I am recording this second video before I have released the first, so I have not taken anybody's feedback on board, nor have I read and incorporated any of your comments or suggestions yet. That is what the third video in this series will be for, so still do leave your thoughts, leave your comments, agree, disagree. If you've got a card you want me to cover, you can make a case for it. I'll try to fit everybody's comments and suggestions in the third video. So with that said, let's dive right in. What cool old bordered cards are we interested or maybe not so interested in bringing to modern? We've got a beautiful, powerful, unique, and majestic card to talk to you right out of the gates about in this video. This is Sylvan Library. Allow me to read you the Gatherer text while I show you the original printing. At the beginning of your draw step, you may draw 2 additional cards. If you do choose 2 cards in your hand, draw on this turn. For each of those cards, pay 4 life or put the card on top of your library. Talk about some archaic templating, a really unique effect, one that is undeniably powerful, one that sees a bit of play in Legacy, but not enough to warp the format by any way, shape, or form. I was also really excited about the prospect of this card in MH1, but I did make the caveat that I thought it was less likely than some other cards I was also excited about, and the reasons for that, I think, if anything, are amplified in 2021. So we do see, number one, that Wizards is more likely to just staple draw a card onto something than to have some kind of really elaborate, difficult to parse, especially for newer players, high variance in terms of how it would slot into various decks, form of card advantage, right? Sylvan Library is very, very inscrutable in these regards. It's one of those that you kind of need to see in action in order to fully understand, I feel. We also have to acknowledge that this type of color pie break, while Wizards is a little bit willing, to dabble in that with cards like Feed the Swarm, this does not strike me as the type of color pie break that they want. Combining a color pie break with a really, as I have said, arcane, unintuitive, complex rules box, I don't know. I just don't see it as very likely at all. And frankly, as much as I think it's really cool, really iconic card, would love to leverage it in Rock, or indeed maybe in a deck like Jund Shadow. I think it could be a really spectacular fit. We frankly have enough card advantage flying around in Modern, and I'm just, for those reasons, that little bit less excited about it. Now, that said, is this type of really unusual card advantage engine more appealing to me than the Fire design? 1000%. If Sylvan Library got printed, I would say, okay, this is a sign that we are throwing caution to the wind. We are delving a little bit deeper than I dared hope into the ancient times of Magic the Gathering. And you know what? I'm all for it. So I don't think it's that likely. I don't want it as quite as much as I used to, but would I say no to it? Absolutely not. Got another unusual one for you here. Spinning Darkness. It is a 6-mana black instant that can be cast for free for the low cost of removing the top 3 black cards in your graveyard instead of paying its casting cost, and Spinning Darkness will then deal 3 damage to target non-black creature. You will gain 3 life. What an interesting card, right? Well, I don't know how to rate it exactly. There's a whole lot going on here. First of all, let's look at the fact that you're only dealing damage to a creature. It is a relatively paltry 3 damage, and the life gain is really nice in a lot of situations, but in the types of situations where the 3 life is nice and where the 3 damage to a non-black creature matters, you are very unlikely to ever be in a scenario where you are hard casting it. Therefore, it becomes a question of, okay, which decks can fill up their graveyard in order to make this a relevant effect, and is the downside worth it? And the thing is, many decks right now, I understand that Dredge definitely still exists, and Oops All Spells is a very powerful deck, but so many decks are kind of using the graveyard as an extension of the hand. That is why there are relatively few Rest in Pieces and Leylines of the Void in the format. There are other reasons for that, but this is one of them, I guess. And there are a relatively high number of value-neutral or indeed value-positive ways to disrupt the opposing graveyard. Surgical Extraction is also at a low relative to different formats that we've seen. The point here is that a lot of people are using the graveyard for incidental value, and they're not dedicated all into filling up the graveyard and refilling it after you empty it for some reason or after it's disrupted. You know, it's just like over the course of the game, a lot of these decks can leverage the graveyard as another way to pull ahead on the value axis. Now, Spinning Darkness actually has a relatively hefty toll that it exacts on your graveyard, specifically because we're looking at having to remove 3 black cards. Now, so many decks could remove 3 cards no problem. Even if, one of them had to be black or something, that wouldn't be much of a problem. But if you think about how these games actually play out, the graveyards are filling up with fetch lands. They're filling up with interactive removal spells, not all of which are black. They're maybe filling up with permission if this is a blue deck seeking to leverage an effect like this, or in general seeking to leverage the graveyard. They're filling up with cards like Mishra's Bauble, right? So Spinning Darkness, definitely difficult to see exactly how easy it would be to cast this for free. Beyond that, you've got, okay, we're dealing damage to target non-black creature. It is only 3 damage, so this is missing out on a lot of the format's most impactful cards. You're looking at stuff like Uro, it doesn't touch. Kroxa doesn't touch in a couple different ways. Dryad of the Elysian Grove, Primeval Titan, Shadow, Scourge of the Skyclaves, the list goes on. However, against other decks, it is actually a really, really nice effect, provided you have a setup, and this would probably benefit a traditional rock deck, or even decks like 8-Rack, something that is very, very strongly based black and heavily interactive. Against these aggressive decks, you can get the tempo, and it's a 2-for-1 of sorts, right? Because you are trading the spell for the opposing creature, and you're gaining 3 life along the way. So given all of the setup necessary, and given how much of the format it misses, I think this is actually a free spell that it's in contention to be very, very safe. Would be an interesting card for the toolbox, but as always, we do run the risk of underestimating free spells. They are so powerful by virtue of being free, if nothing else. So let me know what you guys think about this one. I thought it was a cool one to touch on here. And next up is a card that I think would see relatively fringe play, might boost a few strategies that we would love to see more of, and is very, very safe, which is the exact type of free roll printing. It's a unique effect, it's a cool effect. This is the type of card that I think should be very, very much a slam dunk in a set like MH2. We're talking about Undermine. For 2 blue and 1 black, so it's a 3-mana permission spell. It's an instant counter-target spell. Its controller loses 3 life, so definitely a little bit slow, right? Let's just get that out of the way. 3-mana 1-for-1 permission in a world where Archmage's Charm exists, the modal permission that has a couple different ways to get a 2-for-1 if you don't need it as a permission spell. A simple 1-for-1 with a relatively minor upside is not going to break anything. So, that said, this effect doesn't really exist. Probably the closest thing is Counter Squall. And Counter Squall and Undermine together could form the basis of a Dimir or perhaps a Grixis deck, where they are playing more traditionally. They're not just slamming all the fire cards, all the permanents. That doesn't really jive with the ethos of traditional control, if you ask me. Something that is more permission-oriented and is maybe trying to finish the game with good old bolt snap bolt lines. Something like this could be a role player in a deck like that. Again, not going to set the world on fire, but we don't need every card to. A nice role player like this, incentivizing interaction, providing a unique effect, maybe even being able to steal the game on occasion from a deck that really plays it fast and loose with their life total, I could see this being a very welcome addition. Next up is one of those cards that a lot of people tend to mention when this discussion comes up, and I did touch on some synergy that it has with Veteran Explorer in the last video, but we're talking about Innocent Blood. It is a 1-drop black sorcery. Each player sacrifices a creature. Now we do have to be careful about the synergies. You know, printing this alongside Veteran Explorer and other similar synergistic cards, I wouldn't like, frankly, to port all of that all at once into Modern. Definitely just don't need to be such a pale impersonator of Legacy in that regard in such a direct way. But if we are looking at only this piece in isolation or that piece in isolation, I don't really see an issue with Innocent Blood. There are existing synergies in Modern, you know, if you're looking at decks that really benefit from their own cards going to the graveyard already, you know, Stitcher, Supplier, Shells, Satyr Wayfinder is another card that comes to mind. You definitely have the incentive to play Innocent Blood as a way to disrupt the opponent's board while getting your own stuff accomplished. And frankly, we are kind of encouraging those decks to be a little bit more interactive in that regard. So as long as the synergies are not too much to bear, again, I don't see an issue. This card would serve as a way to push a more mono-black or very heavily based black true control deck closer to viability, which I think is something that could exert a positive influence on the format, and also it does provide another safety valve against something like Boggles spiraling out of control. So Innocent Blood, not going to break anything as far as I can tell. Could be a cool one. And next is a very simple card, but one that there's a lot going on with. The ramifications could be significant. I would love your feedback on this. It is Flame Rift. A 2-mana sorcery for red, 1 gray. Flame Rift deals 4 damage to each player. Again, we love seeing symmetrical design. Those are some of the cards that are the most intriguing to me. And the symmetry of Flame Rift as is really what makes this card interesting. So there are 2 obvious and clear homes for it, in my opinion. We're looking, of course, at Burn, and I made the argument in the first video for the power and the positive influence of a tier 1 Burn strategy as a format policeman in Modern. I think we want actively to boost Burn, if you ask me. Flame Rift is another Boros charm in that regard. It could definitely help. However, as much as I have sung the praises of Burn, the only thing I don't really like about Burn these days is how the play patterns have changed against it due to the printing of the Canopy lands, of Sunbait Canyon in particular, and the Boros Burn Shell. It does not reward you as much as it used to, the deck that is, for interacting 1-for-1. Now, as you interact and you extend the game, even if you're able to stabilize, the Burn player just can see that many more cards to find the redundant pieces to go upstairs and finish you off. Thanks to the Canopy lands, there's not as much of a risk of flooding for them, and therefore less incentive for you, the opponent, to interact on a 1-for-1 basis. Flame Rift could change that, because Flame Rift being symmetrical, if the Burn player sought to leverage it, you know, their life total is definitely not as free as it used to be, thanks to those Canopy lands, as well as the usual fetches and shocks that they're known to play. So, Flame Rift definitely could be not as much of a free roll in Burn as it first appears. The other place where I think it would find a home is in the BRX Shadow and Scourge of the Skyclaves decks, Flame Rift enabling those cards in a major way. However, is it really overpowered there? Is it really even that much of a free roll inclusion there? It's a great enabler. Again, it's a powerful card. It does what we want to do in those decks, but a big strength of those decks is that every single spell can interact or is a threat, right? Or it draws a card. You know what I mean? Like, it's digging you toward things that can be threats or interaction. You know, your lightning bolts, your seal of fires, those things are killing creatures just as often as they are going to face to enable Scourge and or Shadow, right? Flame Rift is definitely going to be great in the enabler role, and also helping to finish the game off, I'm sure, in many cases. But in general, it definitely is not as free as it might look to include a card that can only do that, right? Especially because some of the time you are dancing on that knife's edge with your own life total as the Shadow Pilot. Casting a Flame Rift could either be locked in hand because your life total is already too low, or it could put you within striking distance unwittingly of the opponent, finishing you off. So I think this card is fascinating for how little text is on it, and I would love to know whether you think it belongs in Modern. Next up, I will address a trio of color hosers, and it remains to be seen whether Wizards has any interest or intent whatsoever in printing these types of color hosers in Modern. Sometimes you do get the sense that they wish the ones that did make it through, mostly from 8th edition, frankly, like Choke and Boil, you get the sense that they maybe wish that these did not exist. But on the off chance that they are interested in taking us back in time to that type of design space and that type of thinking where color hosing is kind of a safety valve for a certain archetype or a certain color running away with the format, well, we have a few intriguing ones. I don't think we should print them all into Modern. Some of them are maybe too powerful, others of them maybe a little bit surplus to requirements, but a card like Chill is a really interesting safety valve, especially against base red or mono red decks, because they don't have good ways to answer enchantments. Many of them cannot answer an enchantment whatsoever, and Chill is not completely locking anybody out of the game, and I guess unless maybe the red player is stuck on one or two lands, but Chill is certainly going to slow their roll a little bit, give a reactive player, a blue player, an interactive player time to stabilize, and again, maybe providing a safety valve against red-based combo decks, or even just like a really, really powerful prowess variant. So again, whether I think these are very likely, probably not, but it's worth remarking upon that some of these old color hosers do exist. They could play intriguing roles in a format like Modern. But don't get too comfortable, Blue Mages, because a Tsunami is heading for your shores. That's right, Tsunami, the green boil, the slow and telegraphed green boil, right? It's just like Boil, but it's a sorcery, thereby making it much worse. You know, there's been a lot of games. A very common play pattern is when you have the boils in post side, you hit that turn 4, you're on, let's say, Jund, or maybe Gruul. One of these decks that can play Boil, you've sided it in, it's relevant in the matchup, and you've got a lot of gas in hand otherwise. You're going to go to your turn 4, make your land drop, and pass. And then, obviously, the ideal is that the opponent just taps out for something that you can beat next turn, you get to boil them while they're tapped out, all is well. But in many cases, it's just a matter of being able to force some bomb through permission on that crucial turn 4. So you're very happy to pass if the opponent doesn't tap out, you go for the boil. Maybe they don't have any permission and you just get to boil them out and then untap and win the game from there. More likely, they'll trade their Cryptic command, maybe for your Boil, then you untap and you resolve your Bloodbraid Elf or whatever else it's going to be. So, not a great example, because you'd be happy to cast Bloodbraid into permission most of the time, but you understand the point. Anyway, the point here being, Tsunami is much, much worse simply because it is a sorcery speed, and when Boil is a good card, you're going to want it to be an instant for sure. I have gone so far as to say that if a Jund Triome existed, I would do a micro splash of red for Boiling Rock, playing a single Jund Triome, maybe a single Blood Crypt or something like that, in order to be able to play Boils in my sideboard of what would otherwise be a straight green-black deck. So obviously, the printing of Tsunami into Modern would enable me to not have to wait for a Triome or not have to engineer a micro splash in some other way. We'd just play the green one, right? But again, don't hold your breath for these color hosers, if you ask me. And the final color hoser before we move on to a different category of cards is Nature's Ruin. For 2 gray and 1 black, a 3-mana sorcery, destroy all green creatures, and the helpful portal reminder text said, this includes your green creatures, so don't forget about that. And, I for reasons that are maybe pretty arbitrary, I think something like this is maybe more likely than Chill or Tsunami to get printed. Again, I wouldn't necessarily expect it, but there is this anti-green creature kind of subcategory that does kind of lurk around the edges of Modern with stuff like Hibernation and Deathmark. Nature's Ruin would be, I think, a much more powerful effect on average than those. Again, we're looking at something that the cool thing about the color hosers, as long as they're not blatantly overpowered, is that they almost by definition only see play when they have to. They only really see play when the format is going out of control in the direction of the color that the color hoser is hosing, right? So yeah, otherwise you're giving up way too much equity to include cards like this in your 75 if you don't, if you just have an irrational vendetta against green creatures, Nature's Ruin's not that good. Over time you're just going to stop playing it, right? So again, am I really the strongest advocate ever for these cards? Not so much, but I think there are some intriguing ones. I wanted to highlight them here. Now let's move on to some other stuff. Well, maybe we need Nature's Ruin, my friends, to combat the Tier 0 elf deck that would be unleashed with the printing of Wirewood Symbiote. No, not really. I mean, elves would still fall apart in the face of heavy interaction, and they are still the type of deck where they incentivize interaction, and they're also a cool, iconic, core tribe in terms of thematic concerns of Magic the Gathering, as they are of many fantasy worlds, and I'm a huge, huge fan of elves. I just wish they were viable in Modern. Right now, they're really not. There's actually a couple interesting spoilers for elves so far, and maybe we'll see more. I certainly hope we see more that are potentially Modern playable, but until then, let us proceed as though the elf deck is still kind of languishing in Tier 3 or lower, needs a big boost. Wirewood Symbiote, arguably the best card to do that. I'm not exactly the very biggest fan of doing it this way, though, simply because Wirewood Symbiote is one of those things that does kind of give the elf deck power in that it stymies interaction. You can bounce elves with the symbiote in response to removal and generate mana that way, or tempo. You also will generally find this card incentivizing play patterns like bouncing Elvish Visionary to draw a lot of cards while accelerating with mana, or replaying Dwynen's Elite to make a lot of tokens. That's just a couple of examples. So we are... we lack, without Glimpse of Nature in Modern, among other cards, we maybe lack some of the combo-oriented synergies that we see out of Legacy Elves, for example. Wirewood Symbiote could enable those combo-oriented synergies and deck structures too, but without some of the missing pieces, I'm afraid, as much as I would love to have this card helping boost elves, it would not be my first choice, because it is just going to turn elves in some ways, or at least in some cases, to another deck that just draws a ton of cards, right? So what about a different way to boost elves in Modern? Well, how about Pauper and Legacy staple Birchlore Rangers? Unlike Wirewood Symbiote, this does not enable grinding for days. It does not enable those repetitive value-generating play patterns. Instead, this just helps the elves elf ball as they were intended to do, in a way that is really unique. You're not just printing Findhorn elves, for example, into Modern to give elves the 9th through 12th traditional Llanowar elf-style Monodork. Instead, this is a card with a lower floor, because on its own it doesn't do anything, and a higher ceiling, because you can tap 2 untapped elves, enabling really explosive turns, even if they're summoning sick, to add a mana, and that mana can be any color, so it also enables mana fixing. In Pauper, you see elves, splashing blue, for example, for Distant Melody, off of a very bad mana base, usually consisting of only one island, at least half a year ago, the last time I played Pauper. And part of the reason they're able to do that is because of Birchlore Rangers, so this could enable some really interesting things for elves in Modern. I think it's a more interesting card in many ways than Wirewood Symbiote, probably a little less powerful, but given the different supporting cast, I'm not even certain that's true. I know that Birchlore Rangers will not break anything, whereas with Wirewood Symbiote, yeah, I guess you never know. Finally, you've got that interesting morph ability where you can, in the face of Plague Engineer, you can do something, you can play a Grey Ogre. It can trade with the Plague Man, it can stop the attacks, it can maybe erase if you were ahead before the Plague Man hit, and allow you to do something while you're digging for removal for the hate piece. So Birchlore Rangers, I think I would prefer over Wirewood Symbiote if I had to pick one or the other, but it's probably not going to do much to lift elves up from where they currently are without a little more help, but I do think this card, either way, belongs in Modern. Now, we could spend hours covering all the possible elves that could feasibly have a case made for them. I will not do so. This is the final elf I'll look at. Just another thing that Birchlore Rangers accomplishes is enabling a card like Skyshroud Elite, if it were modern shifted via MH2, that is, to be included, because right now it might be a little difficult for an elves player to justify just a very efficient beater, which is all this is. It's a 1-drop elf, it's green, gets +1/+2 from the base stat of 1/1 as long as any opponent controls any non-basic land. So yeah, it's very efficient, it's a good rate. If you're playing the green-black beatdown deck, going wide, getting some attacks in, finishing with Shaman of the Pack, this nominally is a good fit for it. In practice, do they just need things that are more consistent? What would it really replace? Well, if you are playing Birchlore Rangers, you would then have two different ways between the Rangers and the Heritage Druid to make Skyshroud Elite a mana producer the turn it comes down, and then kind of leading the charge in subsequent turns, assuming the attacks are good. So I just want to point out that Birchlore Rangers can incentivize other cool printings or other cool synergies of stuff that maybe already exists in the format. We can have a snowballing effect where this stuff kind of quietly incentivizes each other in a really synergistic tribal way. It all becomes a little bit more viable on the strength of each other's abilities. So I hope that made sense, and I just really want to see more elves in Modern. What can I say? I've got a weakness for this tribe. I think it's so cool. Have I got you on the tribal train yet? Well, be careful what you wish for. This is the Tidal Warrior. I don't think you're ready for this game-breaking power of the 1-drop 1/1 merfolk that can turn a land into an island until end of turn via simply turning sideways. It is an activated ability that definitely plays well with Merfolk's land screw plan that is not as central as it used to be. Spreading Seas is no longer a guaranteed stock 4 of in every mono blue list. In the past, you would have seen maybe a 7 or 8 Seas deck, including the card Seas Claim, to supplement the all your lands are islands type of plan alongside the traditional Spreading Seas. And Tidal Warrior could, I guess, enable 12 Seas in theory. In practice, it would probably be played alongside 4 copies of Spreading Seas, because unlike Seas Claim, this is still an in-tribe beater. It's still very low cost. It can still go wide when you need to go wide, or when the land screw plan is not on in a really weird kind of convoluted way. This is similar to Vindicate in that regard. It gives a currently existing fair deck a little bit more of incidental game against really broken land-based strategies that are otherwise hard to interact with while remaining on plan for the deck's plan A. In the case of a Dead Gael deck, for example, it's destroying the opponent's permanents. In the case of a Merfolk deck, it would be playing the tribal fishmen and going wide. So shout out to my buddy the Dogfish. I think I pointed this card to him out back before MH1. We were hoping for it then. It never came. The Dogfish and I are still holding out hope that we see Tidal Warrior. But of course, the first time I play against this and get land screwed out of doing anything while the Merfolk Island walk past me, I'll regret ever wishing for this. But anyway, is this the type of card that's going to bust Modern in half? No. Is Merfolk the type of deck that could use a bit of a boost? Yeah, overall, I would say so. And, some of the more recent design space for Merfolk has maybe played a little bit too safe, and I think in some ways you have to. We cannot discount the power of 8 2-mana Island Walk Lords, the supporting cast for those. If they tweak the levers a little bit too high, could get out of control really, really quickly. So Tidal Warrior, definitely a good enabler, definitely a good flexible card. I could see it. Here's an interesting one. I think it'd be very safe to print into Modern. Breaking Point. 1 gray, double red for a 3-mana sorcery. Destroy all creatures unless a player has Breaking Point, deals 6 damage to him or her. Creatures destroyed this way cannot be regenerated, so the obvious comparison is Anger of the Gods. It's a red sweeper for the same exact casting cost at the same speed, but Anger, dealing with everything, no matter what, and exiling it, provided it's toughness 3 or less. So leaving aside the exile clause, which is very relevant, in some ways Anger is just more of the same from red. It's just like, yes, red can already deal with small creatures, and Anger represents the ability to do that in the form of an X for 1, while hosing graveyard strategies. Very powerful card, but red does not really have access to Modern playable true sweepers, especially if you're looking, of course, at a mono-red deck. Breaking Point could provide that in the context of the proper shell. The reason this card is not busted is because it is a so-called Punisher card where the opponent gets to choose which mode it is, and unless you're really heavily pressuring their life total, they're just going to take the 6, right? But that goes back to the notion of having Burn exert a lot of pressure on the meta, and if we want Burn to be able to do that, maybe one tool in their toolbox helping them to accomplish that would be a card like Breaking Point if they need to reach for a Damnation style effect, or if they wish they could. Maybe now they can, because very few opponents will be happy to give the Burn player a 3-mana deal 6 under most circumstances. So a card that I think, again, is perfectly safe. Maybe not the very most interesting we've ever seen, but thought I'd bring it up here. Pretty cool one I found while digging around on Scryfall. Speaking of cool ones from the archives, how about this? How about some do or die action? Are you ready for this ultimatum? It is a 2-mana black sorcery, 1 gray, 1 black. Separate all creatures target player controls into 2 face-up piles. Destroy all creatures in the pile of that player's choice. They can't be regenerated. Some regeneration hate in the last couple cards, by the way. Not really worth remarking upon. Regeneration is not much in Modern, and they don't plan, from what Wizards has said, of making it a feature of future sets. I think it is a little too difficult to understand, a little bit too complex needlessly, right? That is at least how it is viewed. Regeneration is a bit of a nostalgic mechanic for me personally, but I do understand that. Anyway, any Liliana the Veil player loves the prospect of separating permanents into piles and getting rid of one of them. Do or Die is really, really interesting. Ultimately might not quite be powerful enough to see play, and therefore I think is a fine printing, because I think it's at risk of homogenizing removal or completely overriding the format. At the same time, it's a super unique effect, the likes of which do not really exist. So the reason I don't think it's going to see all that much obvious play in terms of displacing other removal is because it is horrible on the play. You're like, okay, I've got my removal spell. You played a turn 1 creature. I'm right where I want to be as a mid-range player. Do or Die actually can't do it. And if they have 2 creatures by the time, let's say, turn 3 rolls around, or maybe your turn 2 if you're on the draw, well, they get to keep their best one, right? It's just kind of a diabolic edict that also does not get around indestructible in the way that an edict effect does. However, where Do or Die starts getting really interesting is in the mid to late game. And maybe I'm kind of hypothesizing about a format that doesn't necessarily exist anymore, but I'm thinking of like mid-range mirrors or mid-range versus other fair deck matchups, let's say humans or something else that can amass a relatively wide board state. Maybe the humans player has more power on board. Maybe there's like a Goyf and a Scooz on the rock side holding back the attacks. People are concealing information. Humans player able to play through Ether Vial at a moment's notice. Rock player maybe holding up removal. We've all been there. Rock players in the past and BGX mid-range players in the past have reached for cards like Damnation. In some of those situations, Damnation is kind of what you want to draw, but obviously it feels pretty bad, to just wipe your own half of the board too. Maybe the opponent is also slow rolling a redundant threat or two to rebuild in case of a sweeper. Here's where a card like Do or Die comes in. Do or Die is going to enable you to get a nice X for 1 under those circumstances, and one that I might add is also one-sided and mana efficient and very interesting in skill testing for both players in a similar but far less deterministic way that the Liliana of the Veil alt is. So the fact that it is so cheap does enable you to subsequently double spell. You're not like wrathing the whole board and saying go. You're going to Do or Die, and then the board state is going to be more favorable to you, but not deterministic. And then from there, maybe it's a Scooz activation, maybe it's a follow-up kill spell after you see which pile your opponent picks rather, for Do or Die. Maybe you can set up a Liliana Edict if you have a very hard-to-answer card that you can put in a pile on its own. The list goes on. I think this is a super intriguing card. We love the old bordered black cards, obviously. That's a big selling point for me. It's a cool name. It's really interesting art. And I think the card itself is definitely one that has my ears perked up. Let me know what you guys think about Do or Die. Definitely a spicy one if you ask me. Next up is a cool card, one I'm not going to say much about, but I thought to mention it here and highlight it, because this and similar cards are just an interesting subcategory, if you will, of design space that did exist in the past, could potentially exist in Modern. We're looking at Reverent Silence. For 3 gray, 1 green, it is a sorcery that you can cast for free. If you control a forest, instead of paying the mana cost, you can have each other player gain 6 life, and you get to destroy all enchantments. So let's be clear that Back to Nature exists, a higher floor, lower ceiling card, destroy all enchantments for 1 generic 1 green, and that doesn't really see any play, right? So my point here is that these free spells, with a downside, even if the downside is not all that relevant, granting an enchantment player life gain when you're on a green deck, yeah, probably not the most relevant downside, but there is a downside. And also, but beyond that, the notion that a spell like Back to Nature, again seeing virtually no play, will suddenly explode in play and really warp or dominate the format or homogenize answer cards in a format just because it can be cast for free with a downside under certain conditional circumstances, I don't think that is ever really going to happen, so it is a safe printing in that regard, at least this specific card. Of course, other examples of similar free spells might be much less safe. But so a relatively innocuous printing that could also serve as a built-in important safety valve for the format in the event of an unforeseen lock piece or synergy or combo or something really overriding the format. The ability to cast spells for free, as we've seen from the Force cycle in MH1, which had relatively mixed levels of play that it's yielded so far, but even a card like Force of Vigor sees a lot of play in older formats. Force of Negation, obviously a modern staple. The notion of free spells is something that Wizards is clearly not allergic to, right? So, card like Reverent Silence, maybe some other similarly designed cards, who knows, they could play a role at some point in this or a future Modern Horizons set. And next up is Psychatog, a great purveyor of nostalgia for many a Magic player. For 1 gray, 1 blue, 1 black, you get a 1/2 Atog. Activated abilities, discard a card from your hand to give it +1/+1 till end of turn. Exile 2 cards in your graveyard from the game. Also, giving Psychatog +1/+1 until end of turn. Now for me, I was always a kitchen table casual my whole life up until whatever it was, 4 or 5 years ago now at this point. And therefore, not every card that took extended in the early days or the old standard formats by storm, they didn't all cross my plate, right? Psychatog never crossed my plate, but even just like looking through cards as a kid, at stores and seeing other people's cards and stuff, the Atogs are definitely a nostalgic creature type for me. Now, as far as printing into Modern, it does a lot. And at the same time, I don't think it would really do anything, if that makes sense. So number 1, it is a finisher in the same way that Tarmogoyf does, but in a more temporary but higher ceiling way. It does reward you for just playing an interactive game of Magic, and then of course it can come down and go a little bit crazy. But again, you're shoving a little bit more all in than you would with the Goyf, and of course it costs 1 more. So I don't think it really compares, even though there are some interesting parallels there. And it is arguably more interesting to realize that Psychatog could almost be regarded as a finisher as the secondary role. It is a very, very powerful discard outlet simply because there's no limit on the number of times you can use that activated ability, right? And then the idea might be more, you fill up the graveyard, you do graveyard synergistic things, whatever those are going to be, that are often difficult for the opponent to overcome with traditional interaction. But if they are able to overcome it, or they are able to compete with it somehow, well, you can go to the plan B of Psychatog and just buff it up using all of those discard effects and try to cheese out a win with some really big swings that way. All of that said, for a beater, especially one that doesn't stay big for the whole game, 3 mana is a whole lot. For a discard outlet, as much as it is repeatable and no cost once you resolve it, 3 mana is a lot. And for any other synergies it might have, again, you're looking at a 3 mana spell. So ultimately, I think that more than anything else is what keeps it as a safe printing for Modern. That said, the nostalgia factor, the fact that it is unique in several different ways, I think this could be an intriguing one to print in, even if it's just fan service. Hey, you know what? There's not anything wrong with that, if it's not going to break the format, which I don't believe it will. And finally, let's cover arguably the most powerful, or one of the most potentially powerful, one of the highest ceiling, certainly, cards we've seen thus far. It is Stifle. And whereas in my first video I talked mostly about the cards that the Discord members were really exploring the pros and cons of, here I have talked more about ones that were mentioned by the by without much argumentation fleshing them out, or are ones that I came up with here. Stifle is the exception in that the Discord is split on them. We've got a couple people who are excited about it. I think a majority of people are leery of it and do not wish for it in the format. And Stifle does a lot of things. It does a lot of things, and with other cards that I have made the case for, it can fail. It's not got, the ability to replace itself. It can rot in hand if the opponent is not actually doing these things that it can counter. It is really a bad top deck if you're already behind. The list goes on. That said, the nature of the play patterns generated by Stifle are really what has me saying no to it. Specifically, the fact that you're blowing out fetch lands for just 1 mana. It's just the type of thing that, number one, is likely to be too powerful in that it will often decide games, even if the overall win rate of decks trying to stifle opponents' fetch lands isn't too high. So many games will be decided by that one action that I think that would probably be deemed unacceptable by the powers that be. Number two, even though this does incentivize a tempo playstyle, and that's another thing that I really don't mind, the extreme value generation I think is the biggest enemy of Modern. Stifle is definitely not right along the path in that regard. In a way, it actually fits so cleanly into the piles, because in theory you look at a card like Stifle and say, okay, well maybe it would suck getting my fetch land stifled or whatever, but at the end of the day, if the Delver decks are gonna need Stifle to get back into viability in Modern, maybe that's worth it. But really what happens is Stifle is just such a high ceiling card, and the Uro piles draw so many cards that they can play Stifle, and they can see a ton of cards, so even if Stifle is rotting in hand for a while, maybe they don't care as much as a deck like Delver that does not just draw cards unto eternity, right? And the other thing about Stifle is it just feels, and I know this is a little subjective, but I think most people would agree, I think it feels more like a legacy card than virtually everything we've covered here so far in these two videos. And while I do advocate probably far more than the average player for bringing more old bordered cards into Modern, more existing cards into Modern, and maybe cool it a little bit with the new design for the Modern Horizon sets relative to MH1, I definitely want the formats to remain distinct in identity, and Stifle is part of this category of legacy cards that just feel like they should stay in legacy to me. But if you've got a strong argument for printing Stifle into Modern, please do leave it below. Okay, I lied, I do have one more. I nearly forgot about a very cool card. Pauper Stable Fireblast. This was mentioned by maybe Lotus's Dan and also by Nostier most recently, and Fireblast is just like the other burn spells in that I think I want to boost burn, but I am very, very leery of printing more than one of these very powerful effects into Modern. We have to pick one. Fireblast is really intriguing in that it does incentivize shoving all in, and therefore improves permission. If your regular old Lava Spike gets countered by a Monolith, that's magic as Richard Garfield intended, right? That's fine, and you've got a deck full of redundant Lava Spike style effects, and maybe the blue player won't have permission the next time the game goes on. If you shove all in with a Fireblast at the wrong time and the opponent counters it, including with a free spell even when they're tapped out like Force of Negation, well, maybe you just Stone Rained yourself twice for a total of 0 lands remaining on the battlefield, right? So Fireblast, undeniably powerful and insanely high ceiling, and don't get me wrong, I don't want to undersell this card. This card is actually really nuts. A free deal for. And it can go to the board if it really needs to. But we actually touched on Spinning Darkness. This Why don't we go full circle and tab back over to Spinning Darkness if I can find it? There we go. So some very different effects, but we're looking again at a 6 mana hard cast versus a free but conditional and definitely punishing if you get punished for it free casting cost. Now, Fireblast is a more powerful card overall than Spinning Darkness, simply because it is going to go into decks where you always want this effect, whereas Spinning Darkness, for all its upsides, you're not sure whether it's going to line up in any given matchup. So Fireblast, very powerful. The last thing to say about it is it does maybe incentivize mono red burn, or at least it does put the brakes a little bit on the otherwise free roll nature of the Boros Burn land base, because Inspiring Vantage is not a mountain, and neither is Sunbaked Canyon, and if you're playing Fireblasts, you have to have a critical mass of mountains to be able to sacrifice, that is for sure. So, could Fireblast provide an incentive to make burn mono red, and how would that change things? I don't know, but this is a card that I thought worth mentioning. Okay, my friends, well, of another very long, very fun for me, I hope for you too, breakdown of a lot of beautiful old bordered cards that could potentially be candidates for modern shifting via MH2, and I hope you liked it. I hope you like these long digressions, these long breakdowns, but hey, if you're here for the second video, it means you probably watched the first one and you probably liked that. So I hope you like this one too. I hope you will stay tuned to the channel for the third installment in this series, as well as my coverage of the actual Modern Horizon spoilers as they come out, and everything in between, Kaldheim spoilers and the usual modern gameplay, maybe dabbling into some other theory as well. Thank you very much to all Patreon supporters and to all viewers. As always, leave your thoughts below, and I will talk to you soon.